Well, hello, welcome to the final week of CST1530, Intro to Christian Theology. I'm Chris McElmurray, your instructor, and we are finishing up this week with Eschatology, the unit on last things. And so you read a lot in Erickson, pretty much the entire unit there, chapters 39 through 42. Your question this week is, how ought the knowledge of the final judgment affect the way a person lives? So there are practical implications, and I'll leave that to you to talk about those. So we have the doctrine of last things, or final states. Okay, so that's what eschatology means. One of the things Erickson brings up is he talks about eschatomania versus eschatophobia. Eschatomania is the just people who think everything is about eschatology. They have eschatology tinted glasses. Everything they see, it has to do with eschatology, whereas eschatophobia is usually people who are so sick of the people who are eschatomaniacs that they just don't want to talk about it at all. Now, I grew up in a church that was very, very focused on eschatology. We had prophecy conferences every year. I won't go into it, but there's a lot of eschatomania going on there. And so for a while I was into that until I just got sick of it and I became eschatophobic. And as a result of getting back into hermeneutics and focusing on interpretation, I've learned to regain a love for eschatology, but it comes with the price of asking, what is the original context saying? And so with that, I will give you a caution, okay? And that caution is this: when we are studying this subject, because it's a subject that draws so many people due to their curiosity, because the biblical sources vary in their clarity, and because people's conclusions are going to vary in their degree of certainty, we must be on guard against undue, overstated speculations when it comes to eschatology. And this is where people make this is where the conspiracy theorists make a lot of hay here, and you have a lot of websites out there, and books are published all the time. There's a very popular novel series that's out about this kind of stuff. So some comments as we begin. Eschatology is not just about the future. It's also about the present that leads to the future. It has present implications for us. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a little while. There's at least one element of predictive prophecy which cannot be regarded as already fulfilled, the fullness of the kingdom. There may be others as well, but that is definitely one of them. We look at the world around us, and there are things that are not set right yet. And so as a result, that means that the kingdom has to continue growing. We'll talk more about that. It's important to differentiate between essential points of eschatology, like the return of Christ, and less important points, whether or not there's a pre-tribulational rapture. Okay, so when we talk about essential stuff, what is essential? And I have a friend of mine that I know and love, but he actually was talking about leaving a church because they didn't hold to a very narrow sliver of a position that he held on eschatology. I think it was the pre-wrath position. Because they didn't hold to that, he was talking about leaving. And I was like, dude, seriously, you're kind of splitting hairs. At any rate, the fact is that's not essential. If you would have asked Jesus' disciples, what does it take to follow this guy Jesus, they wouldn't have pulled out an outline and said, well, it takes this doctrinal point, that doctrinal point, and you have to have this particular understanding of how things are going to go down in the end. It's something that is just kind of foreign to discipleship. That's when we get into our secondary and our third order issues. what's essential is the big stuff. And so let's keep the main thing the main thing. Let's talk about two focuses in eschatology. One is individual eschatology, and that's what occurs to each individual when he or she dies. And general eschatology, that's what happens to the human race, what happens to the entire creation in connection with the second coming of Christ. This is also known as cosmic eschatology. So as we discuss individual eschatology, oftentimes we speak of the intermediate state. Now, why is it intermediate? What does it come between? The intermediate state is a condition between one's death and one's resurrection. It's often thought of as heaven or hell. And the way we sum this up, if you want to hang a keyword on heaven, think of the presence of God or being with God. If you want to hang a keyword on hell, think of absence of God or absence to God or separation from God. Okay? When it comes to heaven, the term is used in at least a couple of senses. The Hebrew shamayim is plural, it's heavens, and that's because, that's how the ancient Hebrews viewed the universe. They saw the universe as a multi-tiered situation containing not only the sky, but also the abodes of celestial beings above and beyond the firmament of the sky. For monotheistic Hebrews, this would be God and the angels, but other ancient Near Eastern societies believed, that there were multiple gods. The general orientation of this usage is the up-there-ness from the perspective of human observers at the level of the right here-ness. Now, another usage of heaven, another sense, is when it is used as a virtual synonym for God, or, as well as God's presence, like we spoke of. You can see this when you see kingdom of heaven used in Matthew, and in the other Gospels you'll see most often kingdom of God. And so kingdom of heaven is a way of speaking of God. When Jesus tells the parable of the prodigal son, and the son turns home and he's trying to give his speech to his father, when he plans it out, he says, I'm going to say that I've sinned against heaven. He's saying I've sinned against God. That's a shorthand way of referring to God without having to say God. Now when it comes to hell, that's also used in some different nuanced senses. One is just a simple reference to the place of the dead. We see this in the Old Testament references to the grave or the pit. These are associated with the Hebrew word Sheol, which was later translated by the Greek word Hades. In the New Testament, Hades seems to be used for the disembodied condition of those who are separated from God after death. There's another word that's used. It's brought over from the Hebrew. It's transliterated into the Greek. Gehenna comes from Gehinnom. This refers literally, it literally means Valley of Hinnom. But this was a place outside of Jerusalem where flagrant idolatrous acts formerly took place during the Old Testament era, and as a result, this earned a curse for Jerusalem and by extension the people. Figuratively, this seems to be used to refer to the condition of those who remain separated from God after the resurrection and the judgment. So this last sense that we're speaking of does not reflect the intermediate state, but a final state that we'll talk about later. So you need to understand the mainstream idea in Judeo-Christian thought, we'll say Christian thought, is that the intermediate state is a disembodied existence, that the immaterial, incorporeal spirit, soul, your consciousness, your mental or intellectual faculties, your person, is separated from your body and continues to exist. That is the idea of the intermediate state. It exists either in a mode, state, or a place with God, or separated from God. Now, some Pauline support for this. When we look at 2 Corinthians 5, 6 through 8, Paul says, while we are at home in the body, we are away from the Lord. Later he says, yet we are confident and satisfied to be out of the body and at home with the Lord. So for Paul, out of the body equals home with the Lord. Now this is for believers, obviously. He says in Philippians 1:23 and 24, he says, I have the desire to depart and be with Christ, which is far better, but to remain in the flesh is more necessary for you. So for Paul, once again, to depart his flesh is to be with Christ. It seems that there is a continuing existence. People want to debate over consciousness, and that brings us to some alternative views here. One of these views is soul sleep, and this term can either refer to the idea that the soul during the period between death and resurrection reposes in a state of unconsciousness. That's a very simple way of viewing it. A more developed direction would be the Adventist view that a person is a unitary entity without components, so there's no body-soul distinction, that you are a soul in that thinking, and that you just cease to exist at death. Sometimes this view is also combined with other positions known as conditional immortality. You only get resurrected if you're a believer, if you're among the righteous. Or annihilationism, where you are resurrected but then you're annihilated, you're made to nothing. So it combines in different ways with some of these other views. Purgatory, most people ought to know about this in the Western Christendom, the Western tradition, that this is a Roman Catholic doctrine that taught that those who are in a state of grace but are not yet spiritually perfect, they go to a state of temporary punishment, since they're either not entirely free from venial sins, that's kind of less serious sins, not mortal sins, or have not yet fully paid the satisfaction due to their transgressions. So you have to suffer some to be made fit for heaven, and that's the idea of purgatory. You see it in the root word purge. You have to be purged by fire or whatever. There's different ideas on what constitutes purgatory, different levels, all that kind of stuff. So some of the implications of death in the intermediate state. Death is to be expected by all. This is something that comes to all people. While death is an enemy, let there be no mistake about that. The way the Bible portrays death is that it is not our friend. It's not just another part of life. I know we hear that sometimes around the funeral home. We hear these things in counseling and grief counseling and comforting people. But death is the enemy. Death is about separation. Death is about loss. Death is about falling off the radar. It's about estrangement. It's about distance. And so it's about absence. It's about exile. Death is the enemy. It's God's enemy. It's our enemy. But God has defeated it through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. So that's the whole idea of victory over death is big, big, big in early Christian thought. Between our death and resurrection, there's an intermediate state during which people experience either the presence or absence of God. And finally, since God's grace, not our works, is the basis for our relationship with God, believers should not fear any post-death purging through suffering. I'll let you look in Erickson for some of the reasons that he lists that, but we won't go into that right now. All right. So what happens at the second coming? Second coming is kind of a big idea. We're starting to get into some general eschatology here. What's the big thing that happens? The first thing on the agenda at the return is the resurrection. Now, when we say resurrection, we'll talk about this momentarily. We do not mean resuscitation. This is not what happens when you get the paddles out and you say clear, and okay, and people are resuscitated after they've been clinically dead for 5 minutes or however long. We are not talking about reviving a dead corpse and that person is alive again and they function and they're conscious and that's great, but they're going to die again one day. It's not resuscitation. Resurrection is a whole different deal. It's a whole different idea. This resurrection thing that's going to happen is big, and it is across the board, and it is everybody. Righteous and the unrighteous. Okay? The good people and the bad people. Alright? And so that's the whole thing about resurrection, is that this is a universal phenomenon. Everybody's going to be resurrected according to the Scriptures. There's no real way around this. There's clear passages on that. In Jewish thought, and as it phases into Christian thought, you see that resurrection is connected to judgment and evaluation, that God is evaluating, okay? And there's this idea that during the judgment, it's not that just he's evaluating, but also that he's setting things right, that there's vindication. And then finally, the final state, that as a result of the decision made here in judgment, that there's going to be a way things are and a way things continue on from that point. All right? So let's talk about who's resurrected. When you look at John 5:28 and 29, this is what Jesus says. Jesus says, "Do not be amazed at this, because a time is coming when all who are in the graves will hear his voice and come out." He's referring to the Son of Man. "Those who have done good things to the resurrection of life, but those who have done wicked things to the resurrection of judgment." Guess what? The wicked are resurrected too. That's Jesus. Okay, don't argue with me. Argue with Jesus. And then Paul says this in Acts 24:15. He's speaking. He's on trial before a Roman official there. And he says, "I have a hope in God, which these men themselves also accept." He's talking about the Pharisees. That there is going to be a resurrection, both of the righteous and the unrighteous. Paul makes it clear. That's Pauline doctrine. It's hard to beat the apostle there. That's kind of orthodox. Finally, Paul says this again in 2 Corinthians 5:10, "For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, so that each may be repaid for what he has done in the body, whether good or bad." Okay? So let's talk about resurrection bodies. The identity and continuity of one's human personality is maintained in the resurrection. You will be you. Okay? You're not going to be someone else. You're going to be you. There's the continuity of identity. Resurrection is not a mere resuscitation of a person's original body, but a transformation or metamorphosis of a person's original body. Okay? Paul references this in Philippians 3:20. He talks about the transformation. He also talks about the difference between a seed and how it grows up to be a tree in 1 Corinthians 15. Resurrection bodies are immortal, they cannot die, and they're incorruptible, they cannot decay. You see this specifically mentioned in 1 Corinthians 15 and verses 53 and 54. And finally, you need to know that resurrected bodies are real bodies. They should not be thought of as merely disembodied spirits or souls. I've talked with people about this, and there's some confusion out there, even among believers. The idea that resurrection is the resurrection of your spirit. Well, that's not a resurrection. That's not what they meant. That's not what the Jews meant. That's not what the Christians meant. And if you want kind of a slam dunk on this, read the resurrection narrative in Luke 24. When Jesus' resurrected body, he appears to the disciples. He's hanging out with them, and he's hungry. And he says, "I want something to eat." And you see that in Luke 24, verses 41 through 43. They give him food. I think he eats some fish. Okay. Well, ghosts, Casper, can't eat fish, can't pick up fish, can't chew fish, can't swallow fish, can't digest fish. Okay, we'll leave it at that. Now, let's talk some more about the big idea with regard to general eschatology or cosmic eschatology. A favorite phrase of British New Testament scholar N.T. Wright, he's one of my favorites, regarding the eschatological progression of God's kingdom in this world is setting things to rights. If you hear him speak, if you read him a lot, you'll see this phrase come up, that God is setting things to rights. That's the fulfillment of the kingdom. And one of the implications here is that we don't have to wait to play a part in what God is doing to set this world to rights in the end. We get to play a part in it right now by setting some things to rights. A time is coming when God will set things to rights by fully redeeming and renewing his people and his creation. A time is coming when the goodness of God, his people and his creation will be vindicated, that justice will be done and seen to be done. But in the meantime, we get to be a part of it. We get to be part of that process. So we need to find some things to work on, and we need to fix some stuff. Not in and of our own power, but through the power of the Spirit. So, something to think about there. You know, if our eschatology isn't good for something here, then maybe it's good for nothing. As I've heard before, if you're so heavenly minded that you're no earthly good, then what good are you? And I think our eschatology needs to be more earthly good. Now let's talk about millennial views. The root of millennial views, this is talking about the millennium. That's a 1,000-year period. This comes from Revelation 20, and the whole flow of the passage there. There's this classic way of reading it. That, what do we do with this millennium? And so there's different approaches. Where do you put all the other eschatological events in relation to the millennium? And so you have a premillennialism that says that the second coming occurs before the millennium, before the 1,000-year reign. You have amillennialism, which says that the 1,000-year reign is identical with the church age, and that Jesus is reigning spiritually over his people. You have postmillennialism, which also identifies the millennium kind of sort of during the church age. In some systems of postmillennialism, it kind of morphs into the kingdom by the end of it. But that he's not just reigning spiritually, that he's reigning physically, the idea that it's going to take over institutions and things like that. And there's different flavors of postmillennialism before the advent of modernism and after the advent of modernism. So, there's different varieties. You have the historic variety of premillennialism and the dispensational variety. So we might talk about those momentarily. With amillennialism and postmillennialism, sometimes these kind of are they're kind of latched onto and modified. There's a preterist idea, the preterism, that we'll talk about that. All right. So premillennialism, historic premillennialism, views the church age, God's renewed people. It's not necessarily that they have a big beef with a distinction with Israel or whatever, but there's the church age, and then toward the end of the church age, there is a tribulation. There's charts, there's stuff laid out in all the slides, so you can see this for yourself. So at the end of the church age, there's a tribulation, and then the second coming happens. There's a rapture. But the rapture is not like the popular idea of the rapture where we go up and we go to heaven to be somewhere else. That's dispensational premillennialism. The historic premillennialist view doesn't even really call it a rapture. It's we go up to meet Christ in the air, then we turn around and come right back down. And that is the first resurrection. There's a millennial kingdom. It can be literal. It might be, give or take, some kind of figurative thing there, depending on which historic premillennialist you're talking to. But at the end of that period, there's the second resurrection, and then there's the judgment, and then after that, there's the eternal state. Now, the dispensational variety of premillennialism, this method of interpreting Scripture goes back to, I'm going to say, maybe the goodness. I'm going to reveal my ignorance here. I want to say it's a late 18th century, early 19th century development. John Nelson Darby comes out of a Plymouth Brethren congregation in England, and he based it off of hearing some woman in a prayer meeting, and she had a revelation about the distinction between Israel and the church, and he thought that's an interesting way to come at it, and so he kind of develops the system from there. And then C.I. Scofield gets a hold of that idea and then puts out a study Bible. And I grew up with a C.I. Scofield, with a Scofield study Bible in the church that I came up in. And so that was one of the biggest ways that this idea, this schematic of history and interpretation has spread. Well, let me tell you what it is. Let me define it for you. Dispensational premillennialism. This says that Christ will rapture the church before a 7-year Great Tribulation. Some people say the Great Tribulation, most people say the Great Tribulation is a particularly harsh part of it, the last 3.5 years. After which he will return to physically reign on earth for 1,000 years. This usually is pretty literal. To fulfill God's promises to Israel. Now that's huge. That last part is huge. What you need to understand is that before the church age, according to these guys, God is dealing with Israel. The church age happens, and there is a radical break. There's a radical distinction. Israel is put on hold. They're a different plan entirely. The rapture happens. The church is taken out. That's the first resurrection. And so the tribulation is a transition period to where God is about to resume his dealings with Israel. You have the second coming at the end of the tribulation, at the end of the 7 years. And so during the millennial kingdom, God is fulfilling his promises to Israel. So he's dealing with Israel again. Israel is back on again. Okay, church is gone. Israel's back on again. And it's at the end of that millennial kingdom, at the end of that 1,000 years, that you have the second resurrection, the judgment, and then the eternal state. Now, when we say dispensationalism, let me just offer a few things to delineate this, to kind of give you some bullet points to help you identify what this is. It's a system of interpretation characterized by the following tendencies. It attempts to take prophecies as literally as possible, most often, okay? Maybe not in every case, but very often they try to take prophecies as literally as possible. They see several successive stages under which God has managed the world throughout Scripture. Sometimes it blooms into as many as 7. That's the ideal number that they love. But the big thing is that there is a strict distinction between Israel and the church, and they treat the church as a parenthesis within God's big plan, which is really about Israel. And they see the millennium literally as a future time when God will bring about as yet unfulfilled prophecies regarding Israel. Okay? They would view other systems of thought that try to somehow integrate or say that the church is part of that, or the church is a renewed version of the prophecies to Israel. They would say that's replacement theology. You're trying to replace Israel with the church, and so they use the word replacement, or supersessionism. That's saying that the church supersedes Israel, and that's not necessarily the case. I think that's an unfair representation of what a lot of people who hold to a different theology besides that belief. Let's go to amillennialism. Amillennialism, is, in the Greek, is to negate something, is no millennium, which is not technically true. What they say is that the millennium should be interpreted symbolically as the church age. That the church is a millennial kingdom, and Jesus is reigning spiritually over God's renewed people. You have the second coming, resurrection, judgment, all in one shot, and then the eternal state. Very simple system compared to the other stuff. A lot less stuff going on. Postmillennialism is very similar to amillennialism. This post is the idea that the millennium comes after, which is, I'm thinking that people are going to have to do a better job delineating between amill and postmill. They're not often are they distinct. In fact, they overlap so much, I'm thinking it's just confusing to separate these two. This is the idea that the church becomes the millennial kingdom, that Jesus reigns spiritually over God's renewed people and eventually over the world, even its regular institutions. You have the second coming, resurrection, judgment, all in one shot, and the eternal state after that. Let's talk about the preterist take on this. Now, some people love preterism, some people hate it, but they do say a few things that people are going to have to deal with. We're going to talk about that in a moment. Preterism is often held in conjunction with either amillennialism or postmillennialism, and it holds that either all or most prophecy about the coming of Christ was fulfilled by AD 70 when the Second Temple was destroyed. Okay? The idea that all prophecy was fulfilled, that's full preterism, and that's rare. You're not going to find too many people with that. You'll find more people who are what they call partial preterists. They'll say that there's a lot of things that were fulfilled in AD 70 that just aren't recognized. And so they would say you have the cross, and then you have the intervening time up to the AD 70 event, the destruction of the temple, the Second Temple in Jerusalem, and that's probably tribulation, but especially those last 3.5 years during the Jewish war, that's big time tribulation. And some people might say, well, this is just coming in the clouds. Another term that's probably more popular is Day of the Lord. That's the Day of the Lord. Now this is playing off the idea that the temple has been destroyed before. 586 BC, the first temple, Solomon's temple, was destroyed by the Babylonians. And this is saying, it's happening again. God is judging the powers of the world and the cross and the powers that are over his people, but also he's judging Israel for covenant unfaithfulness. And so the church, after that AD-70 event, which is huge, and we have to deal with that. Something went down. That was a big deal. All right. Whatever you want to make of it, it's nothing to just scoff at and say, it's not that big of a deal. That was just cataclysmic. It was huge. After that, you have the church is either the millennial kingdom or becomes a millennial kingdom, just like the amill or the post-mill, second coming, resurrection, judgment comes, one shot, and then after that, eternal state. Unless you're a full preterist, okay, which is a whole different deal, but we won't talk too much about that. Now let's talk about alternative positions on final states. The view of universalism is that all will eventually be saved. That would be nice. I wish that was the way things were, but I believe that there's something about human free will that would keep that from happening. And so I just think that there are people who, there's an incorrigibility to some people's will. And you say, well, that's just people who are crazy. If they could think clearly, they'd choose different. Yeah, but I mean, that's kind of how sin affects us. It's kind of insanity. It's a type of insanity. We're not doing what we ought to know better. We ought to know it's right. The second chance, also known as post-mortem evangelism or divine perseverance. And these are people who believe that after death God's going to offer more chances for salvation to those who didn't follow Jesus for whatever reasons. All right, it might be, hey, they were born in the wrong place in the wrong time, or they decided not to become one because they misunderstood it, or because some Christians were jerks and they thought, well, if that's who represents them, I'm not following. So that's the second chance idea. Annihilationism, instead of continual conscious suffering, those who are not or will not be saved will be eliminated and cease to exist. You see the root there, annihilate, to reduce to nothing. Universalism is universalist, everybody. So what about all these? Could any of these be true? If you think about it, you could say, it's possible. It's possible that God is playing his cards really close to the chest on this one, and that he's told us what he's told us in Scripture, but that in the end we'll find that that one of these things turns out to be true. There's another view that a lot of evangelicals like called inclusivism, which is similar in its intent. It wants more people in, and there's nothing wrong with wanting more people into the kingdom, right? Okay, you want people to make it. So it's possible that God has told us what he's told us, but that one of these might turn out to be the way things are, or inclusivism will turn out to be the way things are. However, it must be pointed out that what we have been shown in the special revelation of the Bible does not give us solid reasons to count on any of these being true. The possibility of any of them being true should not be used as a reason not to speak to people about the importance of following Jesus. I heard one apologist, J. Wesley Richards, I believe it was, who did a Pascal's wager type of argument, saying let's take universalism or inclusivism and kind of pair it up against Christian restrictivism or exclusivism, and let's say that you give both of them equal epistemic status, that you give them epistemic parity, that you don't know for sure, but let's say you're kind of giving them equal probability there. He says in that situation you have to do what Pascal does and say which one gives you the most to lose. Which one, if you bet on the wrong one, you lose more. And so one of the things he says is, that would be great if that's what turns out to be true. However, let's evangelize like restrictivists, like exclusivists. Let's talk to people about Jesus because of what we do see in Scripture, because of what we do know. So I think that's wise. All right, let's talk about some food for thought on hell. Let's talk about the role of free will and the importance of right desire. I know right desire sounds kind of Buddhist. How much of a role does human free will play in whether someone ends up in hell or not? Does God send anyone to hell, or do they send themselves there? Erickson talks a little bit about this. There's a couple of quotes. You're not going to see these in Erickson. This is one I pulled from G.K. Chesterton. He says, "Hell is God's great compliment to the reality of human freedom and the dignity of human choice." It's the idea that God respects the image and the intrinsic value in who and what He's made somebody to be, that He's given us the ability to desire and choose on our own, and that He respects that. All right, that's a very interesting take on this. Now, G.K. Chesterton was kind of instrumental, his ideas in Lewis's conversion. C.S. Lewis, my homeboy C.S. Lewis. All right, and Lewis kind of continues some of that thought. C.S. Lewis says, there are only two kinds of people in the end: those who say to God, "Thy will be done," and those to whom God says in the end, "Thy will be done." All that are in hell choose it. Without that self-choice, there could be no hell. No soul that seriously and constantly desires joy will ever miss it. Those who seek find. To those who knock, it is opened. And so I think the way Lewis puts it is what do you want? We'll talk some more about that momentarily. Let's talk about figures of speech. What about the possibility that some of these ways of speaking, these images of hell, are figurative? There seems to be some figurative language at work in some of the imagery surrounding this doctrine. And this is not according to liberal scholars, this is according to some very conservative scholars. I'll read you a quote from one here in a moment. He talks about the flames. He says, but at the same time it's a place of utter darkness. Well, those two images seem to kind of cancel each other out. He talks about the worms as kind of a metaphor. The gnashing of the teeth is kind of representing the attitude. So here you see the severity of what hell is still come through, even though there's figurative language. And this is what J.P. Moreland says. He's a professor of philosophy out at Biola University, Talbot School of Theology. Any figure of speech has a literal point. That's true. If you're speaking metaphorically, the metaphor does mean something. You can't just make it mean anything. Any figure of speech has a literal point. What is figurative is the burning flame. What is literal is that this is a place of utter heartbreak. It is a loss of everything, and it's meant to stand for the fact that hell is the worst possible situation that could ever happen to a person. That's J.P. Moreland. A lot of times scholars will point out that there's a possibility that there's no one-size-fits-all suffering with hell, but that there are degrees of hell. Now, before we say, hey, this sounds more like Dante's Inferno in medieval Catholicism, I want you to hear this because there's something at work here. Now, I don't know if this is what it means, but I'm just throwing this out there. Matthew 11, 20 through 24, Jesus has done some miracles, and there's some towns that were like, and he doesn't appreciate that, and so this is what he says to them. Then he proceeded to denounce the towns where most of his miracles were done because they did not repent. Woe to you, Chorazin! Woe to you, Bethsaida! For if the miracles that were done in you had been done in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented in sackcloth and ashes long ago. But I tell you, it will be more tolerable for Tyre and Sidon on the day of judgment than for you. And you, Capernaum, will you be exalted to heaven? You will go down to Hades. For if the miracles that were done in you had been done in Sodom, it would have remained until today. But I tell you, it will be more tolerable for the land of Sodom on the day of judgment than for you. Now, from a biblical studies point of view, from a hermeneutic studies point of view, it's not a slam dunk that this says, hey, there's degrees in hell. Okay, that it's not a one-size-fits-all type of thing. But this idea that he's saying it's going to be more tolerable at the judgment, it's very interesting, because we see that Tyre and Sidon got judged. We see that Sodom got judged. And that, you know, the people that inhabited those cities that were part of that culture, that they're going to be judged in the day of judgment. But he's saying for you, you had God's revelation right there in your face. The miracles. The Son of Man is doing kingdom work here, casting out demons, healing people. And you're not repenting. You're not getting in line with the new covenant. And so as a result of this, you're more accountable. So it's going to be more tolerable for them. It's weird. What do we do with that? Implications of final states. The decisions we make in this lifetime about who we are going to follow are of supreme importance. So we should do our due diligence when making them. We should be wise. Where are we going to put all of our chips? Where are we going to put all of our investigation? You know, that's that Pascal's wager type thinking. What do we have the most to lose? You know, I'll be all right if this is how it turns out. I'm covered here. But what if this is the way things are? Well, I really need to investigate that. Presence or absence is what makes heaven and hell what they are. The idea of connection to God, or the idea of, you know, that separation relationship. All right. So to keep those two ideas in your mind, that their paradigm, connection and the disconnect, the separation. And our desire toward God and His agenda in Jesus plays a major part in our eschatology. If you want God and His agenda, then follow Jesus. You'll follow Him right into the kingdom. If you don't want God or His agenda, then instead of following Jesus, do what comes naturally. Do whatever you want, whenever you want, however you want, to whoever you want. Want, 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 want. It's about desire. Okay, what do you want? Okay, you want to be God? You want to rule over your own little kingdom? What if He gives you that? What if He gives you a kingdom of one where you can't oppress anybody else, and cold, utter darkness and isolation? What if He gives you that? Something to think about. All right, let's talk about the book, and I've kind of held off till now. The book that most people talk about when they come to eschatology, and that is Revelation. And I want to just say a few words about this, and then I'll kind of let you loose on your own little study of Revelation. I believe that for most evangelicals in the American church, for pastors, for everybody, that we need to adjust the frequency as far as how we study the book of Revelation, how we listen, how we talk about the book of Revelation. Because there's a lot of teaching going on out there that just assumes, well, this is the pastor, or this guy wrote a novel, and so that just makes it right. Oh, look, there's a movie. I guess that's what Christians mean by this. And, you know, 2,000 years ago, in the first century, when these documents were being written, maybe there's a big gap there. Maybe we're not getting the signal right, and we have to fiddle with the dials some and get the frequency tuned in, and then we will hear it better. But when we just tune it any old way, then you get a lot of static there, and we're hearing some things that's not the right channel. So the first thing I would say is to do your homework on apocalyptic. Ask, what genre is it? Okay, you cannot interpret apocalyptic like it's you know, just a regular narrative. You can't interpret it like it's a law code. You can't interpret it like it's a proverb. Apocalyptic is a very specific genre. Who wrote it? When did they write it? And during what circumstances? Why did they write it? What are the stock images that it uses? I mean, if you read Revelation, it's like a comic book threw up. There's wild, vivid images coming out of there. What does all that mean? Tune your mind into the primary question. What was the author's originally intended meaning for the original audience? Okay? Something that they could have understood. They did not preserve this for no reason whatsoever. It was very expensive. It took a lot of time to craft these documents, to write them, to use a scribe, to copy them, to preserve them. And Revelation, if you know the story behind its acceptance into the canon, it took a while for it to get in there. It had to fight to get into the canon. I believe it's in the canon for a reason. I really like it. I think it's God-inspired scripture. However, it had to mean something to that original audience. All right? And so if you're saying that microchips are the mark of the beast, well, then you have to ask yourself, put yourself in the shoes of the original audience and ask, would they have understood the mark of the beast that's spoken about in Revelation? Would they have understood that to be microchips? And if the answer is no, then you're going to have to put that lower on the list of possibilities for the meaning of mark of the beast. Okay? Well, how would they have understood it? Well, you have to look at the context and what is it saying? How would they have understood it? Compare this with Old Testament eschatology. Books like Daniel, books like Ezekiel. There's some stuff in Isaiah. Compare that frequency. Is it just a copy and paste job of these things when you see Daniel and his beasts? Or is there a modulation? Is there a tweaking, a modification? Is there an updating? Like this was for the stuff they were going through back then, and this is about what we're going through with Rome now. That this kind of stuff could happen in the future with any empire that we're dealing with. And that brings us to the next point. Listen out for how the socio-political realities of the original audience might have figured into the message. You can't help but think about, how does Caesar figure into this? How does Rome and the Roman Empire figure into this? That kind of context is in the background. You have to pay attention to that. Ask yourself, does this fit here? All right? It might not fit everywhere, but I guarantee you there's some places where they've got that in mind. After you've done the legwork here, you need to go back and look at the definitions of these popular terms that you hear when it comes to eschatology. Look at beast. What does beast mean? Tribulation, the coming of Christ, the parousia, the presence or the appearing, the millennium. How's that used? When you see them talking first in the first time, is Revelation 20, where you see the first resurrection. Who was the first resurrection? Have you asked yourself that? What was the first resurrection? Let me give you a hint. He's called the first fruits of the resurrection. Something to think about. Robert Mulholland, who teaches a class on Revelation at Asbury Theological Seminary, that first came to my attention when I was listening to his interpretation. I was like, wow, why didn't I think about that? Well, I was thinking about other stuff. My mind had been in a completely different framework, different mindset. Correct the directionality of who or what's going or coming where. Is Revelation a Gnostic book about escaping our bodies on this earth to go to elsewhere, to pie in the sky and the sweet by and by? Or is it a Jewish Christian book where heaven engages earth by coming down and renewing everything? And for a big hint on this, let me read to you Revelation 21, 2 and 3. And this is what John the Revelator says. I also saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared like a bride adorned for her husband. Then I heard a loud voice from the throne, look, God's dwelling is with men, and he will live with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. This has been the movement of the Bible with regard to God and his people all along. God has always wanted to come down and dwell with us. All right. The problem is we see the fall in the beginning. You see the curse, and we would not be blessed. And God has been trying to do that through the covenants ever since. That he wants to be our God and us to be his people, and he wants to dwell with us and among us. It's a theology of presence, and we see that with the Spirit. Well, this is about the fulfillment about that, the actualization of that in Revelation. And so finally I would say, tune the dials on your approach, whether that approach is a preterist approach, idealist approach, a historicist approach, a futurist approach, by synthesizing their strengths and avoiding their weaknesses. That's Robert Mulholland's advice when he talks about these approaches here. Here's the four major interpretive approaches that people use when they're coming to a book like Revelation. You have preterist, which says that most prophecies were fulfilled in the 1st century A.D. So if you say, hey, who's the beast? They would say Nero Caesar is the beast. And Gematria reveals the mark to be the numeric value of Nero Caesar, so the mark of the beast, that's what that is. They would interpret this according to the past. If you do what Jack Van Impe does, and you say, hey, the beast or the Antichrist, he's King Juan Carlos of Spain. That's who he's going to be, today, now. Really? Really? Because Spain is like powerful. No offense to any Spaniards out there, but really? Okay. I used to watch that guy with, anyway. So, idealist approach. The idealist approach says that most prophecies are meant to be interpreted spiritually or symbolically. For example, there's all this battle taking place in Revelation. Well, this is the battle between good and evil, and good wins, okay? So it's the principle behind it. It's a principalizing approach. The historicist view was used some by the reformers when they were coming out of the Roman Catholic Church later on, by some Adventist groups, and Jehovah's Witnesses kind of split off from Adventists. And so most prophecies are meant to be understood as events that take place in church history. So when you see the reformers identify the Roman Catholic Pope as the Antichrist, that's a historicist type of interpretation. The idea that this was written to say, hey, this takes place during church history. And so Adventists would say it's the Roman Catholic Church, or Jehovah's Witnesses, some of them. Now, when you come down to the most popular view, which is out there, and we see this today, the example I'm using is Tim LaHaye's Left Behind series. The futurist approach says that most prophecies, like the biggest chunk of Revelation, chapters 4 through 22, are meant to be understood as events that take place in the future that cluster around the second coming of Christ. And so you have Tim LaHaye's Left Behind series, one of my favorite quotes by Dr. Ben Witherington. He's a major New Testament scholar. He says, we need to leave left behind behind. Left behind needs to get left behind. All right? But that's about, all this stuff is in the future, and the future is about to happen, and we're right on top of it. Now, let's get around to the end of the end, because this is the theology, it's eschatology, it's a theology of how things end up, the telos, the goal. It's not the end of the world. Well, it is the end of the world as we know it, as Arian would say. It's not the end, like that's the end of the story and everything just turns off and that's it. But it's the end of the age, that we are now in a different age. And that this has been something that has been in the works, that God is sovereign over history and has been bringing us to this point. And what I would like to say is that the end is better than the beginning. And that the end is actually a new beginning. It's a better beginning than the first beginning. And we see this, especially at the end of Revelation. In chapter 21 we saw this, that verse 1, there's a new heavens and a new earth. All the old things have formerly passed away. There's a new order. There's a new agenda. There's a new way things are. A new reality. We're the new humanity. We're the new people of God. So we're God's renewed people. Okay? You see a new Jerusalem coming down. A new Zion. The temple is unnecessary. You don't need it. Because there's unhindered worship with God, unmediated. And then you have a new Eden, a new garden. So the whole world is renewed in Christian eschatology, new and improved. After setting things to rights, we see God's desire to bless His creation and His image come full circle from the beginning, but better than before. This is the end, not in the sense that it's where the story is done, but in the sense of the goal. This is what God wanted. Okay? So with that, as I normally sign most of my emails, peace and blessings, I say to you, peace. That's one of the goals. And blessings. Hope you've enjoyed CST1530, Intro to Christian Theology. I've enjoyed being your instructor. So, peace and God bless.